Hey guys, tonight we head back to a time when winter didn't just mean fuzzy socks and hot chocolate. No, tonight we're plunging into the medieval countryside where your roof is made of straw, your diet is mostly turnips, and if you sleep too close to the fire, there's a decent chance your bed catches flame. You probably won't survive this winter, but hey, that's part of the charm. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're watching from somewhere chilly, let me know your local time and location in the comments. It's oddly cozy knowing we're all wrapped up in blankets across the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake slowly, a thin crust of frost blooming along the inside of your nostrils. Your breath rises in little clouds as you blink into the dim grayness of a medieval winter dawn. Above you, the thatched roof of your cottage wears its own icy cap, tiny icicles dangling from the rafters like lazy teeth. No insulation here, just straw, wood, and the occasional rat-shaped hole to the sky. Outside, it snowed last night. Again. The wind rattled the shutters like an annoyed ghost looking for snacks, and your blanket, a coarse wool thing you share with your cousin and maybe also a chicken, did little to keep the cold from nipping at your knees. You don't technically sleep on a bed, more like a wooden frame strung with rope, sagging under a sack of old hay. You shift slightly, feeling something crunch under your hip, possibly a bit of ice, possibly yesterday's stale crust of bread. You don't look. Why bother? Your joints creak as much as the beams overhead. It's the kind of cold that doesn't stay outside. It sneaks in and settles into your bones like an unwanted house guest. And while you may have gone to sleep dreaming of hot stew and warm wine, you wake up to the reality. Cold ashes in the hearth, cold water in the pail, and someone already coughing in the corner. Lovely. This is January, maybe February. No calendars here, of course. Just the sky, your aching limbs, and how long the nights drag on. Historians still argue whether peasants counted time by saints' days or moon phases. But either way, you know one thing. It's the dead of winter, and you're still alive, for now. You pull on your shift, if you took it off at all, and wrap yourself in a heavier cloak, stiff from damp. There's no such thing as dry fabric anymore, just degrees of wetness. Your boots, if you're lucky enough to own any, still hold yesterday's slush. You squish into them with the resigned air of someone who has already mentally accepted frostbite. You nudge the embers in the hearth, but they're sulky and gray. No miracle rekindling today. You'll need to fetch more firewood, and firewood means outside, which means snow and more cold. You sigh so hard it fogs up the nearest window, and outside, outside is worse. The snow crunches underfoot like powdered bone, and the wind slices across your cheeks with a surgeon's precision. No gloves. You press your hands into your armpits like some feral bird trying to reheat its claws. You glance at the roof again, your neighbor's this time. His sagged in last week from the weight of snow and poor repairs. The whole family's crammed into the pig shed now, huddled for warmth among snorting company. At least pigs are generous with heat, even if they aren't great conversationalists. You shuffle to the woodpile, which is both frozen and suspiciously smaller than it was 2 days ago. Someone's been poaching your logs again. It's probably Osric. Osric always looks too warm. Still, you collect a few splintery branches and head back in, kicking the door shut behind you with a clumsy thud. A rooster glares at you from the hearthrug, clearly unimpressed by your survival efforts. He's warmer than you are. He knows it. You manage to coax a small flame back to life, the room glowing with weak gold. You hold your hands out, grateful for the bite of heat, even as smoke starts to curl up into the rafters. No chimney, just a hole somewhere in the roof where the draft steals half the warmth and all the joy. Fun historical fact: chimneys didn't become common in peasant homes until the late Middle Ages. So if you thought medieval folks got to sit around sipping cider by a roaring fire, think again. Most of the time, they were coughing, squinting through smoke, and praying the thatch above wouldn't light up like tinder. You sit back, breath finally slowing, and glance around the room. Your youngest sibling is asleep under a basket. Your grandmother hasn't moved in hours, but is probably still alive. And outside, the sky is turning a lighter gray, like the inside of a wet sock. Just another beautiful winter morning in the medieval world. Oh, and remember that crust of ice you slept on? Turns out, it was the family's last potato. Sorry about that. You don't even try to wash your face. The water bucket by the door is frozen solid, and last time you tried to chip a piece off to melt, you cracked the ladle and got a splinter in your lip. So you settle for wiping your nose on your sleeve, which, let's be honest, is basically what medieval people considered skincare. The fire offers a little more warmth now, though it's more symbolic than effective. It's enough to make you want to survive the morning, but not enough to guarantee you will. You gather your cloak around you again, wool stiffened with damp and old grease from someone else's dinner 3 nights ago. The cloak smells faintly of onions, smoke, and what might be goat. Your stomach growls. Speaking of goats, there's one outside, tied near the barn, and you could milk it if it weren't so busy trying to eat the rope again. Food is, shall we say, limited, not non-existent, just creatively rationed. You had pottage yesterday, again, a sort of gruel made from barley, leeks, and hope. And if it gets thinner tomorrow, it'll be water with a suggestion of vegetables, like a tea made from sadness. You open the pantry and stare inside. Not much. A handful of turnips, some dried beans, something furry in a jar that you're going to pretend isn't supposed to be edible. You grab the beans and put them in a pot to soak. If you're lucky, they'll soften by nightfall. Historians still argue whether peasants truly starved during medieval winters or just dramatically underate. But famine years did happen. Wheat prices soared, crops failed, and whole villages sometimes shrank by a third. In years like that, you didn't eat to feel full. You ate to not die. Outside, the village begins to stir. You hear distant coughing, some shouting, a baby wailing. The usual chorus. Smoke trickles out of the neighbor's thatch, blending into the low sky. No one's happy, but everyone's trying to look busy. Misery shared is easier, or at least makes better gossip. You shuffle down the path toward the communal well, where the ice hasn't yet been hacked away this morning. A few villagers are already gathered, each holding a bucket and wearing the same expression, barely concealed loathing at the thought of breaking water again with numb fingers. You nod to Gertrude, who may be 80 or possibly just 40 with a hard life. She nods back, holding a cracked pot like it's her last friend. "Still cold?" she croaks. You nod again. The conversation ends. You take a turn, swinging the iron bar, hammering it into the ice until water sighs through the cracks. It's satisfying in a grim way, like opening a jar after someone else loosened it. You fill your pail and trudge back, hands red and raw, sloshing ice water onto your hem, which was already damp. So, bonus points for consistency. Fun fact: medieval people rarely bathed in winter, not because they didn't want to be clean, but because water was a luxury and hypothermia was not. Soap was expensive. Heat was more valuable than hygiene. And besides, if everyone stinks, no one stinks. Back home, you check on the beans. Still beans. You check on the goat. Still mad. You check on your grandmother. Still breathing. The bar is low for victories, but you're racking them up. You decide to head to the woods for more firewood again. You're starting to suspect you spend more time feeding the fire than feeding yourself. But without it, the cold creeps in fast. You know the signs: sluggish limbs, slurred speech, the irresistible urge to lie down just for a minute. The last nap you never wake up from, so you go. The path through the woods is crusted in old snow and frozen mud. You recognize the trees not by shape, but by which ones are already half-logged. The forest is quieter now. Even the birds have the sense to shut up in winter. As you chop, you wonder about next week. Will it snow again? Probably. Will your cloak survive another round of damp rot? Debatable. Will you eat something that isn't beige? Absolutely not. You tie the bundle of wood with fraying rope and haul it over your shoulder. Your fingers are numb again. You think about putting them in your mouth, but that just makes them wet, and wet means worse cold later. So you blow on them uselessly and press on. Your cottage comes into view again, smoke barely drifting from the hole in the roof. A few chickens greet you with aggressive clucks, clearly judging your productivity. You ignore them. They laid exactly 0 eggs this week and therefore have lost all moral high ground. You dump the firewood beside the hearth, brush off your hands, and sit down hard on the stool. It creaks in protest, as if it too is tired of this winter. The beans, still soaking. The goat, still angry. Your life, still happening. And you, somehow, still breathing. You rest your head against the cool wall of the cottage for a moment. It doesn't help much. Your breath fogs in front of your face indoors, and your nose is officially giving up. The kind of cold that creeps into your sinuses and settles in your teeth. That's the flavor of this particular winter day. The beans are finally softening, so you throw in some salt. If you can call that handful of grayish crystals salt. Might also be powdered rock. But hey, texture is half the dining experience. You toss in a turnip too, because why not get fancy? Your grandmother groans from the sleeping mat. You shuffle over and check on her, pressing the back of your hand to her forehead like you've seen others do. It's either a fever or just a very inefficient wool cap. She mutters something about the old days, then starts snoring again. You cover her with another blanket. Well, a blanket-shaped piece of burlap that smells like mildew and soup. Historians still argue whether extended families always live together, or whether winter conditions just force them into awkward seasonal reunions. Either way, you're stuck with each other for now, huddled together like beans in a very cold, very miserable stew. The sun hasn't even reached its pitiful winter peak, and already the sky looks like it's calling it a day. You step outside again, hoping to catch a few rays. There's something bleakly hilarious about sunbathing in a season where the sun just apologizes and leaves halfway through lunch. You glance down the muddy path toward the church. The bell hasn't rung yet, which means either the priest overslept or the bell rope froze. You're not judging. Yesterday, you slept with your boots on just so you wouldn't have to rewarm them. Still didn't help. Midway through your stroll, you spot old Walter, probably the only person in town who looks forward to winter, because it means fewer things to repair and more excuses to sit by a fire and mumble about how he once punched a wolf. You nod politely. He raises one eyebrow, which is impressive given the icicles forming in his beard. There's a rumor that someone down in the next village over has a glass window. Not a fancy church window, but an actual household one. Imagine seeing through a wall and not freezing when you touch it. You consider this with the same reverence you'd give a unicorn sighting. Luxury, truly. A crow caws overhead. You reflexively check your pockets. Crows are weirdly judgy creatures, and they remember faces. You once threw a crust at one, and it's probably still planning revenge. You make your way to the village square. Well, mud patch. There's a cart flipped over on its side, probably abandoned for the season, and a few locals are half-heartedly shoveling slush from one area to another, accomplishing absolutely nothing. You join in for a bit, if only to look busy. A woman named Maud offers you a small cloth-wrapped package. Inside is dried fish? Maybe. You thank her anyway. She's had a good year, apparently. 2 of her goats didn't die. That counts. Later that day, after your shift moving water from one frozen place to another, you head to the smithy. Not to forge anything, you're not that exciting, but just to stand by the embers and pretend you're warmer. The blacksmith grunts a greeting and gestures to a safe spot by the coals. You're not supposed to loiter, but honestly, everyone does it. Here's a historical tidbit. Blacksmiths were some of the most vital community members in medieval villages, not just for horseshoes and weapons, but for repairs, tools, hinges, locks, even needles. And yes, during winter, they were also unlicensed providers of toe-thawing therapy, while the smith hammers a bent sickle back into something vaguely useful. You let your brain wander. You think about the stories people tell around the fire, about witches in the woods, wolves with eyes like coins, saints who walk barefoot through snow to prove a point. You half believe them. Winter does strange things to the mind. Back home, the beans are boiling, though one still crunches when you bite into it. You decide that's the chef's signature. Your grandmother wakes long enough to mutter that it needs more garlic. You lie and say you'll add some. She's asleep again before the fib finishes leaving your mouth. You eat the stew quietly, the fire flickering in the corner, casting your shadow on the wall like a hunched ghost. It's not good, but it's warm, and that puts it high in the rankings of the week's experiences. Then comes the nightly ritual, layering every piece of cloth you own onto your body. Undergarments, 2 tunics, wool cloak, patched socks, fur hat that might be cat. Everything except the table runner. You need that for a pillow. You slip into the shared bed, which is really a box of straw topped with a lumpy blanket and surrounded by people who snore like oxen. You curl toward the fire, hoping the heat lasts a few more hours. Probably not. Last night, someone tried to feed the hearth with dried cow dung, and the room still smells like regret. You stare at the ceiling beams until your eyelids grow heavy. The quiet settles over the cottage like a blanket. Just your breath, your heartbeat, and the faint rustle of mice chewing something they definitely shouldn't. Outside, snow begins to fall again. You wake before dawn, not because you're eager to seize the day, but because someone beside you sneezed violently into your face. You groan, wipe your cheek with the inside of your sleeve, which, let's be honest, isn't much cleaner, and shift around, trying to feel less like a bundled sausage. Outside, it's still pitch black, the kind of thick, rural dark that makes your own house feel slightly haunted. You stumble out of bed and head to the fire pit. The embers are cold. Of course they are. You poke around for something dry enough to catch, maybe a splinter of last year's stool or a failed wooden spoon. Eventually, with effort, and no fewer than 4 curses whispered into the straw, a flicker catches. As the room glows faintly orange, you notice someone's taken the last crust of bread. Naturally, it was probably you, yesterday. But still, how dare past you? The water in the bucket is frozen over, so you chip it with the blunt end of a knife. You slosh some into a pot, set it over the fire, and try not to think too hard about the film floating on the surface. Is it algae or ghost residue? Let's go with vitamins. You dress in your now traditional indoor-outdoor combo, layers upon layers of cloth that smell faintly of smoke, sheep, and pickled onions. You tug on your boots, frozen stiff at the ankles, and stomp them into shape like you're mad at them. Then it's out the door and into the teeth of winter again. The snow crunches underfoot with a brittle texture, like stepping on stale pastries. Your breath rises in long wisps, joining the columns of smoke from distant chimneys. The sun is a vague rumor behind a gray ceiling of clouds. If the day had a face, it would be frowning. You pass the baker's hut. He hasn't lit his oven yet. Maybe he's still asleep, or maybe he's out of flour again. Grain has been tight this year. Historians still argue whether grain shortages during particularly harsh winters were more often due to crop failure or just laughably bad transport infrastructure. You don't really care which. You just want something doughy and hot. There's talk of a fair next week, a winter fair. That's optimism bordering on delusion, but it gives people something to grumble about. You overheard someone yesterday asking whether they'd have dancing. Dancing in 3 feet of snow, wearing shoes made of hope and string. Good luck with that. You take the long route to the pasture. It's not your pasture, technically, but your cousin's ox is in there, and she's gone to stay with an aunt for the winter. You're the lucky replacement. The ox is standing exactly where you left it, looking just as unimpressed with life as you are. You break the ice on its trough and toss it a few handfuls of hay. It grunts appreciatively or resentfully. Hard to tell with oxen. You lean against the fence and watch your breath drift away like a lazy spirit. A few birds peck at the hard ground nearby. You vaguely remember someone saying birds that don't migrate are secretly magical, or cursed, or just stubborn. You give them a respectful nod just in case. Later, you find yourself at the chapel again. The door creaks open and you slip into the cold, stone silence. It smells like wax and old wood and something that might be sanctified mildew. You sit in the back pew, not out of reverence, but because the priest sometimes hands out hard biscuits after morning prayers. The chapel isn't heated, of course, but at least it's enclosed and quiet. And for a few moments, you let yourself drift, not quite praying, not quite sleeping, just existing. There's something oddly calming about the stillness here. When you step back out, you bump into Agnes, the priest's sister. She offers you a strip of dried apple. You accept it with ceremonial gravity. It's chewy, slightly sour, and the best thing you've tasted in days. You savor it for as long as your teeth allow. She tells you, in a near whisper, that someone saw a wolf near the edge of the forest. That's the third sighting this week. Of course, wolf might just be a very grumpy dog, or a pile of snow shaped like a menace, but it gives people something to panic over besides the weather. Wolves in winter. Now there's a theme. Historians still argue whether medieval wolf attacks were genuinely frequent or just exaggerated for storytelling. Either way, you decide to stick to the paths with footprints. No point starring in someone else's cautionary ballad. On the way home, you pass the town's midwife. She's trudging through the snow with a bundle of herbs and an expression that suggests she's done with everyone's nonsense. You nod respectfully. Midwives are the closest thing your village has to both doctors and therapists. By the time you return, the fire's burned down again. Of course, you sigh, pile on more wood, and try to feel grateful it's not raining. Yet. That was last week. Freezing rain, nature's cruelest punchline. You settle in with what's left of the stew. Now, more paste than soup. You eat slowly, partly because it's hot, partly because there's not enough for a second bowl. The flavor has improved slightly, or your standards have plummeted. Probably both. Before sleep, you stare out the little shuttered window. The sky is navy now, deepening to black, and tiny flecks of white dance across the air like ash. The wind moans low through the beams. You pull the blanket tighter. Somewhere beyond the dark hills, you imagine spring waiting in exile, sharpening its green fingers. But that's months away. For now, it's you, the cold, and the quiet. Morning creeps in grudgingly, like a tired cat, unsure if it wants to be inside or out. You wake to the muted sound of someone outside coughing into the snow and the sharper clink of a frozen bucket being knocked over. Welcome to another exhilarating installment of Medieval Winter, starring you, still cold. There's frost on the inside of the shutters this time. That's always a nice touch, like winter is trying to redecorate your home with sparkling doom. You rub a little hole in the icy film with your sleeve and peer through. The entire village is wrapped in white stillness. Smoke drifts straight upward from chimney tops, as if no breeze dares disturb the general mood of seasonal despair. You throw on your cloak, wool, thick, and still not enough, and head out for your next vital task, the latrine. Ah, yes. The joy of walking half a field length to use a glorified wooden box in sub-zero temperatures. Historians still argue whether medieval people used chamber pots more often in winter out of convenience or simply because the outdoors was too dangerous at night. You suspect it's both. Or maybe they just got good at holding it. The outhouse is slightly tilted, as usual. You brace one foot in a snowdrift for balance and try to ignore the frozen seat. It's too early for deep thoughts, but you briefly wonder whether anyone in history ever invented a sheepskin toilet cover. Someone should have. Back in the village, the blacksmith is already hammering away. You pass by, waving a mittened hand. He nods back, red-faced and sweating despite the cold. The forge is one of the few warm places in town, but it smells like scorched metal and boiled shoes. Still, some people come just to stand near the heat and pretend they have something to fix. You stop by the communal well, which, like everything else, is rimmed in ice. Drawing water becomes a group project, with one person holding the bucket and another chipping away with a stick that once resembled a ladle. There's chatter today about someone's sheep giving birth in the night. Twins, apparently. A miracle. Or a headache. Hard to say. Someone else says the Lord Steward passed through yesterday, counting firewood stacks. Taxes are due. Of course they are. Even when the roads are buried in snow and your fingers crack from exposure, the realm still wants its share of your meager heat. You pretend not to notice the steward's cart parked by the inn. The horses look as miserable as you feel. One of them sneezes, and the resulting spray sparkles in the air like festive droplets of medieval doom. Your boots are wet again. They always are. The leather is cracked at the toes, and you've stuffed scraps of linen inside just to make them feel less like ice molds. You daydream about socks, real socks. Wool ones that didn't belong to a dead uncle first. Just a little luxury. Historians still argue whether peasants had real winter clothing or simply layered themselves until they resembled lumpy furniture. By midday, you're helping reinforce the cottage roof. A neighbor's collapsed under the snow last week. No one died, which qualifies as good news. You pass bundles of straw up to the thatcher. Old straw, brittle, half-rotten, and hope gravity doesn't add you to the casualty list. Your gloves are stiff. Every nail you drive feels like a tiny betrayal from your own hands. Later, you help lug firewood to the widow by the hill. She gives you a hard candy in return, and honestly, that's a fair deal. You suck it slowly, savoring the vague taste of molasses and the faint hint of lint. It's the most excitement your mouth has had in days. Dinner that night is thin porridge again. You chew slowly, not because it helps, but because it prolongs the illusion of fullness. Your teeth ache from the cold. Everything tastes like boiled memories. Someone tells a story by firelight. A wolf again. Or maybe a ghost. Possibly both. It's hard to follow. The shadows dance across the walls, flickering like slow-moving thoughts. You let your head droop forward, chin nearly touching your bowl. Just a short nap. No one notices. A log pops, and you jolt upright. Outside, the wind's picked up again, and snow slides off the thatch with a dull thump. You add another stick to the fire and blow gently, coaxing orange back into flame. The room glows for a moment, soft and uneven, painting everyone in warmth that doesn't quite reach their bones. Before bed, you wrap your feet in a scarf. You stole it from your cousin last summer, during a very minor family disagreement about goats. It's ugly, but it's warm. And in winter, fashion is what keeps your toes attached. As you curl under the furs, you hear the barn door rattle. Probably just wind. Probably. Still, you make a mental note to check for fox tracks in the morning. The chickens have been agitated lately, and you don't want to spend a week explaining to your aunt how you lost one. Again, sleep comes in slow waves, punctuated by the creaking of wood, the occasional cough, and the persistent question, is that your breath fogging, or has the roof started leaking again? You don't get an answer, but you're too tired to care. And tomorrow, well, it'll be the same. The cold, the chores, the waiting, and maybe, just maybe, a second piece of dried apple. Morning again. You don't bother opening your eyes at first. You can already feel the cold licking at your nose like an overeager ghost dog. Somewhere in the room, someone is coughing that special kind of winter cough. Deep, phlegmy, and meant to announce that yes, they survived another night, just barely. You sit up and everything cracks. Your spine, your knees, possibly your sense of hope. The fire's burned out, of course. You forgot to bank the coals last night, or maybe you did, and they just gave up out of spite. Either way, it's freezing. There's a layer of frost on your blanket, which seems unnecessary, frankly. Today's chore list isn't so much a list as a lifestyle. First stop, feeding the animals. You stumble out into the dawn and immediately regret being born in this century. The wind hasn't died down. It never really does. And it slices across your face like it's trying to exfoliate you down to the bone. The barn smells like hay, manure, and warmth, which is a surprisingly comforting combination. The animals are steaming with body heat, clustered close together like furry survivalists. You envy them. You toss feed into troughs, break the ice in the water buckets, and give the goat a sideways glance. She gives you one back. Neither of you trusts the other. Out in the distance, you hear someone ringing the chapel bell. It's not Sunday, which means someone's either gotten married, died, or declared that their roof collapsed again. All valid causes for concern. You mentally wish them luck and carry on with your morning because you too are balancing dangerously close to chaos. Mid-morning is wood chopping time. Again, it's always wood chopping time. Your arms are sore from yesterday, but the pile hasn't shrunk at all. The axe handle is so cold it burns. You swing anyway, establishing a rhythm that's equal parts useful and cathartic. The logs split like promises. Some clean, some messy. Historians still argue whether peasants spent more time chopping wood than doing any other task. Judging by your splinters, probably yes. You wonder, as you always do, why no one ever invented a good glove, or even a decent thumb protector. Your fingers are slowly turning into decorative icicles. You trade a few pieces of firewood for a handful of dried beans from a neighbor who looks just as miserable as you feel. It's not quite bartering. It's more like communal desperation disguised as generosity. You nod at each other in mutual acknowledgement of the winter code. Don't ask. Don't freeze. The village priest passes by, muttering about sin and the importance of humility. You wonder if he ever has to fix his own chimney. His robes look a little too warm, and the smell of roasted chicken clings suspiciously to him. Still, he hands you a small roll of bread. You're not proud. You eat it slowly, one crumb at a time. Back at the cottage, Someone's trying to fix the window shutter that keeps swinging loose. You join in, holding the frame while another person hammers away with something that used to be a spoon. It's teamwork, in the most basic sense. No praise, no thanks, just a mutual agreement that the wind shouldn't blow directly into your soul every night. Lunch is, well, not quite a thing. You chew on a bit of turnip and pretend it's something else. Anything else. Maybe a roasted pigeon with rosemary. Maybe cheese. Real cheese. Not the questionable lump you found under a floorboard last week. That one had a name and a smell. You decided not to investigate further. By afternoon, your body has mostly given up trying to feel anything. The wind whistles through your clothes like a nosy ghost. You help spread ash on the icy path near the well, trying to keep someone from slipping and cracking their head open again. Last time, it took 3 days to find a healer, and even then, they just handed over a poultice and wished you luck. You pause at the edge of the fields, staring out at the snow-covered nothingness. It's quiet in that eerie, pre-storm sort of way. A raven caws overhead, and then immediately regrets it, flapping away like it's late for a plague. You glance at your boots again. They're worse now. One of the soles is flapping like a lazy fish, and every step squishes ominously. You're starting to suspect the cold is eating you from the ground up. But then, someone hands you a scrap of cloth. For the boots, they say. You nod. Winter breeds resourcefulness, and also very low standards. Evening creeps in faster than expected. The sun never really rises this time of year. It just sort of hovers behind the clouds like a shy candle. The sky turns the color of old dishwater, and you know it's time to light the fire again. You coax flame from damp kindling, muttering encouragement to each spark like a tired coach at the end of a losing season. Eventually, the fire catches, and the room fills with uneven warmth. You sit by it, steaming slightly, your cheeks tingling with the unfamiliar sensation of heat. Someone tells a riddle while mending socks. It's about a knight, a goat, and a cursed spoon. You don't understand the point, but you laugh anyway. Because why not? Laughter is warmth too. The snow falls heavier outside now. You hear it against the shutters, soft and steady. The wind howls down the chimney once or twice, but then gives up, sulking. You wrap yourself tighter in your patched cloak and look forward to the dream you've been crafting every night this week. A world with indoor plumbing and central heating. That's the fantasy. And yet, somehow, you endure. The wind finds new ways to creep in overnight. It's less like a breeze and more like a cold-blooded burglar who's deeply invested in stealing your comfort. You sleep curled around the fire pit, boots still on, because taking them off risks frostbite, or at least losing a toe to some vindictive draft. When morning finally dribbles in, gray and limp like an overcooked onion, you rise with the same enthusiasm as a stone rolling uphill. You blink, sniff, and stretch until your joints sound like an ancient church door. Outside, snow has piled up so high against the walls, the cottage looks like it's trying to disappear into the earth out of shame. Today, you're heading to the bakehouse, not to buy bread. You'd need coin for that, and you have precisely none, but to help haul firewood and maybe sneak a warm moment near the oven. It's barter disguised as charity disguised as logistics. You trudge through drifts up to your knees, snow sneaking into your clothes like it's got backstage access. The streets aren't cleared. Why would they be? The people here just walk through the snow until a path is accidentally created. It's community engineering at its laziest and finest. You pass the cooper's hut. He's hammering away on a barrel lid, steam rising from his breath and his temper. Legend has it he once threatened to marry his tools just to ensure someone would listen to him complain. At the bakehouse, the warmth hits you like a blessed slap. The giant communal oven radiates heat like a friendly dragon, and you take your time stacking logs nearby just so you can bask in the glow. The baker grunts in approval or disapproval. It's hard to tell with bakers, but you're handed a piece of stale crust, and that's as good as a feast in winter. Mainstream fact. In many medieval towns, communal ovens were standard. Villagers brought dough from home and paid a small fee or labor to use the town oven. It was more efficient and less of a fire hazard than everyone baking individually, especially when houses were made mostly of wood, straw, and wishful thinking. The bread smells divine. It always does. Even if you only get scraps, it's a better scent than goat dung and damp wool, which is what the rest of your day usually smells like. You chew slowly, trying to make the flavor last longer than the actual food. It's a game you're quite good at by now. Once the logs are stacked and your hands have mostly thawed, you wander back into the chill, regretting every step. The snow has a cruel sense of humor. It waits until you're far from warmth to whip itself into little flurries that slap your face. Like tiny frozen bees with bad attitudes, you pass a neighbor dragging a sledge filled with kindling and cabbage. You nod. They nod. No one speaks. Talking wastes breath, and breath is precious. Besides, what's left to say in the dead of winter? The weather? No thanks. Midday brings chores you pretend you'll only do for a bit. Scraping ice from the roof's edge. Mending a fence that broke again under the snow's weight. Checking the thatch for holes, which is basically a game of how much snow can we let in before we call it a skylight. You remember the story of your great uncle who once tried to plug a roof leak with dried cheese rind. It worked for a day. Then a dog climbed up and ate it. Medieval innovation often teetered on the edge of desperation and delusion. Scholars still argue whether peasants actually lived this rough all the time, or whether our image of medieval suffering is slightly exaggerated. But as you chip ice off your own bucket with a spoon and pray for a less crunchy wash-up, you feel pretty confident you're not starring in a romanticized fairy tale. Later, someone calls you over to the well. It's frozen again. Of course it is. You take turns with the hammer and chisel, hacking through the ice like you're searching for Atlantis. After 20 minutes, you strike slush and everyone cheers, which is both hilarious and sad. Someone makes a joke about marrying the baker just for bread privileges. Another says they'd marry the well if it would stop freezing. You're not sure if they're joking. Honestly, you're considering proposing to the oven yourself. Evening falls fast again. It sneaks up while you're still trying to count whether your fingers have turned blue or just fashionably purple. The firewood pile is lower than you thought, which is upsetting because you chopped half a forest last week. It's like the cold eats fuel just to taunt you. You try to remember a time you felt warm for more than 5 minutes. It's a blur. You wonder if summer was a dream someone told you once. Dinner, if you can call it that, is a weak stew and a crust of old bread you've soaked to revive. You stare into the pot, like it's a magic cauldron that might surprise you with something edible. It doesn't. Still, you're not alone. Others sit nearby, hunched around the fire like pilgrims at a shrine. Someone starts humming. Another tells a tale about a wolf spirit that blesses those who survive the harshest winters. You all pretend not to believe, but you listen extra closely anyway. As the flames crackle and shadows play on the walls, you look around. Everything hurts. Everything's cold. But somehow, there's a rhythm to it all. A strange peace in surviving, in outlasting the night, one brittle breath at a time. Morning begins, as it always does, in a medieval winter. Long before you're ready, and without asking your permission. You stir, under scratchy wool blankets, your nose already numb. The fire has burned down to sleepy embers. One of your toes is suspiciously unresponsive. You're not sure if it's asleep or applying for early retirement. You groan, sit up, and immediately regret it. Every joint seems to have signed a strike agreement overnight. Outside, the snow has done that annoying thing again, falling silently, then piling up dramatically like a surprise guest with bad manners. There's more of it somehow. You start to suspect the clouds are bored and just showing off now. Today is wash day. Because medieval winter isn't cruel enough without adding wet laundry to the mix. You drag yourself to the wooden tub and pour in water fetched, no exaggeration, block by block from the barely thawed well. Even with a kettle of water heated over the fire, it's still a lukewarm insult to your hands. You roll up your sleeves and plunge your fingers into the basin, gasping like someone slapped you with a fish, which honestly might be preferable. As you scrub, you remember how laundry was traditionally women's work, though in some households, it rotated or was done communally. Wash days could double as gossip sessions or even minor social events. If you count cursing about stains as bonding, the soap is harsh. Homemade lye, ashes, and a faint smell of last season's regret. Still, it's better than nothing. Or worse, like perfumed herbs masking an unchanged tunic, which a few neighbors are definitely guilty of. You rinse each piece and wring it out like you're wrestling a soggy snake. Historical fact: in most medieval villages, laundry was only done occasionally, sometimes once a month. Because it was labor-intensive, water was freezing, and clean clothes didn't rank very high on the survival pyramid. Washing yourself was even rarer. Historians still argue whether medieval people truly stank all the time, or if we've exaggerated it just because they didn't use lavender-scented conditioner. You string up the wet clothes across the rafters. They drip rhythmically onto the floor, forming little puddles you'll later slip on. It's fine. You already twisted your ankle last week, falling into a snowdrift, so symmetry, right? Outside, the wind has picked up. Again. It's the sort of wind that has opinions and no indoor hobbies. You wrap yourself tightly in your cloak and brace against it to head for the woodshed. You'll need more firewood, again. The pile seems to shrink whenever you blink. Maybe there's a firewood thief with tiny hands, or maybe the cold is just eating your patience. As you split logs with a dull axe and a duller mood, your mind drifts to those wealthy enough to afford peat or coal, which burn longer and smell slightly less like burnt swamp. You try not to resent them too much. After all, someone has to live in draft-proof stone houses and eat things besides soup made of turnip peels. You remember the story of a local noble who imported cinnamon just to sprinkle it on his winter wine. You, on the other hand, once cried tears of joy when you found a wilted onion in your food scraps bin. Perspective. Your hands ache with effort, but chopping wood is one of the few activities that warms you slightly, right up until you stop. Then it's back to shivering and muttering. You stack the logs neatly and carry them inside. On the way, you pass two boys trying to sled down a frozen ditch using a broken chair. One falls off, laughs, and then immediately cries. Childhood is tough. Later in the afternoon, you help patch the roof again. The thatch keeps slipping under the snow's weight, and the hole in the corner has become a running joke. Literally, it's been leaking water steadily for 3 days. You plug it with straw and a pair of ruined socks, because you are nothing if not an innovator. Inside, someone's trying to make dinner from the dregs of the pantry. It's a soup again. You peek in and see mostly broth, a few wrinkled beans, and what might be half a beet. You ask no questions. You'll eat it and be grateful, because anything hot is a gift, and you've long since adjusted your standards to not actively poisonous. Fringe tidbit. Some medieval folk believed cold air itself was dangerous to inhale and could carry spirits or illness. It wasn't unusual to wrap faces in cloth, not for warmth, but to ward off bad humors. You kind of wish that worked. You'd wrap your whole body like a burrito. Dinner is quiet. The fire crackles. Someone mutters a story about a man who once slept through an entire winter in a hollow tree. Another claims it happened to their cousin's cousin. You all nod solemnly. Whether it's true doesn't matter. You want it to be true. Deep down, you wish you were that man in the tree. As night falls, you check the shutters one more time. The wind howls like it's trying to sing opera through a cracked window. You toss another log on the fire and sit close enough to warm your socks, but not so close that you risk them catching fire. Again, R.I.P. to your old pair. They served bravely. You watch the flames flicker and your breath mist in the air. It's a strange kind of comfort, this routine. A loop of misery, so familiar, it almost feels like home. You survived another day. You washed some clothes. You found a beet. That's a win. And as your eyelids droop and the fire settles into a glow, you think about tomorrow. It'll be cold again. It'll be hard. But maybe, just maybe, someone will bring back a rabbit, or tell a new story, or patch that one drafty crack by the door. It's enough for now. You wake up to a strange silence, not the peaceful kind, like birds on a spring morning. No, this is that heavy, muffled silence that happens when snow has fallen so thick overnight it's cocooned the whole village. You sit up slowly, neck stiff, and realize there's a frost pattern forming on the inside of your wall. That's right, inside. You breathe out and watch the mist of your own breath hover, like a ghost unsure where to haunt next. The fire's out, of course. The embers didn't survive the night, and neither did your motivation. But it's morning, which means it's time to pretend you're a functioning member of medieval society. First things first, you check the animals. You bundle up in as many layers as you can physically wear without collapsing under the weight. Your boots are still damp from yesterday, and the laces are frozen. You're not convinced they weren't plotting this. The barn is about 20 paces from your front door, but in this wind, it might as well be in another kingdom. Inside the barn, it's barely warmer, but at least your animals are still alive. That's no small victory. The cow's water trough is frozen solid again, which means another trip back inside for boiled water. The chickens glare at you like you personally invented snow. One pecks at your ankle in protest, then immediately regrets it. Chickens don't like icy toes either. You gather eggs. There are two. One is cracked. You cradle the good one like it's a crown jewel, because in winter, it kind of is. Historical fact: livestock was essential not just for food, but for warmth. In many homes, smaller animals were brought indoors overnight to help share body heat. Yes, that's right. You might wake up with a goat breathing directly into your ear, and you would be grateful. You refill the hay, offer a few kind words to the sheep, they don't respond, and head back to the house. Your hands are red and raw. If someone handed you a warm stone, you'd marry it on the spot. The day's big task: repairing tools. Winter dulls everything. Blades, tempers, hope. So you sit by the rekindled fire and begin sharpening the old scythe. You don't need it now, of course, but spring will come eventually. It always does. And in winter, sharpening things is about more than preparation. It's about holding on to some illusion of control. Outside, the snow begins again. You think about the people who didn't survive the last cold season. A neighbor who got caught in a storm while hunting. An old woman whose roof collapsed in the night. A child who caught the chill, which is medieval speak for "we have no idea what this was, but it got serious fast." Historians still argue whether the sheer death tolls of winter were from cold exposure, starvation, or underlying illness made worse by close quarters and dampness. You try not to think about it too long. You distract yourself by organizing the tool rack. Axe, wedge, dull saw you've promised to fix for 3 years. The knife you use for everything. A wooden spoon, inexplicably. You put it in your belt anyway. Midday brings its own weird ceremony. Snow removal. Your house's thatch roof is looking heavy. You know the sound of it caving in from experience, and you'd like to not relive that. So you grab a stick and head outside to poke at the snow like an angry squirrel. The snow dumps in one glorious sheet. Unfortunately, most of it lands on your head. You stomp around the yard, clearing paths. Your body is warm now, but your patience is not. A neighbor passes by and nods at you in the solemn, exhausted way that says, "If I stop walking, I will fall and never rise again." You nod back. Medieval solidarity. Fringe. Tidbit. There were winter superstitions tied to everyday survival. Some believed if your shadow was long and sharp in winter, it meant an early spring. Others hung dried herbs around doors, not for flavor, but to ward off frost spirits. You're not entirely convinced they were wrong. As evening creeps in, so does hunger. You open the food cellar, more like a hole with a lid, and take inventory. Beans, root vegetables, something that might once have been cheese. And, oh joy, a lump of barley. You can make something that resembles a stew if you squint and use your imagination. You set it to boil, throwing in a bay leaf you've been saving for months, like a treasure. It smells faintly of hope. You hum a song you don't remember learning, the kind passed down through generations without ever being written down. And for dessert, you gnaw on a dried apple slice like it's a luxury truffle. After dinner, Someone knocks on your door. It's the old man from 2 houses down. He's brought a scrap of waxed cloth for window sealing and a story about a wolf he swears he saw near the tree line. You've heard this story before. It changes slightly each time. Now, the wolf has glowing eyes. Last time, it spoke in Latin. You let him talk anyway. Because storytelling is warmth too. It's what fills the cold hours. What distracts your mind from your aching back, your frozen toes, your growing worry that spring may never come. Eventually, he leaves. You add the wax cloth to your draftiest window. You wrap a shawl around your feet, and you settle back near the fire. Its orange glow dancing gently on the walls. You close your eyes, just for a moment. Outside, the snow keeps falling. Inside, you're still here. You drift off briefly, lulled by the quiet crackle of the fire and the occasional groan of timber expanding from heat. But before long, the wind begins its nightly howling. Not in a poetic, ghostly way, more like a disgruntled bear with indigestion dragging itself across your rooftop. You jolt awake. For the second time today, you consider moving to a sunnier century. Your breath fogs again in the air. The fire has dimmed. You shuffle over and feed it another piece of wood. Your stack is thinning fast. You're already calculating how many more days it can last and whether the logs in the woodshed are dry enough yet. Spoiler, they're not. You left one inside to test it yesterday, and it hissed in protest like an angry goose. Still, you can't sleep cold. So you grab the log anyway and shove it on top. The fire accepts it with all the enthusiasm of a wet sock. At this point, your blanket is more patch than fabric. It's made from a mix of wool, old tunics, and, you suspect, part of a sack once used to hold onions. It smells faintly like that still. You wrap it around your shoulders and settle in again. This time, you hear the sound of a rat scrabbling along the beam above your head. You name him Alfred. He ignores you. Typical. The conversation earlier about wolves has you glancing at the window. Nothing there, of course. Just glassy blackness and snowflakes clinging like little white invaders. Still, you can't help wondering, were wolves really a danger to villagers in medieval winters? Historians still argue whether wolf attacks were genuinely common or simply exaggerated by storytellers eager for drama and excuses to explain disappearances. But fear of them was real enough. Whole villages formed wolf hunting parties, especially during harsh winters when both man and beast were starving. Speaking of which, your stomach growls again. The apple slice did not satisfy. You get up and rummage in the cupboard for anything vaguely edible. A crust of bread. Too hard to chew, so you dip it in water first, like a biscuit, for a very sad tea party. Still better than nothing. You whisper a little thanks to whichever saint is in charge of crusts and survival. You notice your neighbor's chimney is smoking. That's a good sign. Means they made it through the night too. You smile to yourself, weirdly proud of this shared resilience. You've both made it to another day in a world where snow could mean isolation, firewood was currency, and the line between fine and frostbitten was laughably thin. Later that day, the village bell rings, one long toll. You pause, spoon in hand, as do several others. You know what that means. Someone's house lost its roof. Again, you bundle up and go outside, joining the small crew trudging across the village green. The snow is waist-deep in places, and your borrowed boots fill with ice on the first step. You say some very unfriendly things in your head. Turns out it's old Martha's roof, the one patched with fish skins and wishful thinking. A corner gave in under snow weight, and half her belongings are soggy now. You help move the wet bedding inside and begin nailing extra boards to the roof. You're not a carpenter, but you're better than the local miller, whose main contribution is moral support and a lot of swearing. Fringe. Tidbit. In some medieval towns, roofs were made from turf or seaweed, depending on local resources. Seaweed roofs weren't just waterproof. They also smelled horrible in summer, but they held heat well in winter. A trade-off you're starting to envy. You work until your arms ache and your fingers no longer feel like fingers. Back home, you struggle to undo the frozen laces of your boots, finally resorting to just yanking your foot out and letting the boot collapse wherever it pleases. By evening, it's snowing sideways. You sit with your back against the wall, staring into the fire. Your hands are red and split. Your nose has entered a new phase of cold, somewhere between numb and betrayed. To pass time, you pull out a bit of embroidery you've been working on. It's crooked and kind of ugly, but it's something to do. You thread the needle with stiff fingers and begin adding uneven stitches to what was once supposed to be a dog, but now resembles a melted cow. You decide not to tell anyone what it was meant to be. In these moments, the quiet becomes bearable. The firelight flickers gently. Alfred the rat makes another appearance, then disappears behind a beam with what looks like a stolen grain seed. You let yourself imagine spring, muddy roads, warm rain, and that first day when you go outside without 7 layers and don't immediately regret it. You dream of berries, of warm sun on your bare arms, of bread that doesn't taste like desperation, but not too much. Spring dreaming is dangerous. It makes winter feel longer. Another day down. You made it. You're still here. Morning arrives again, not with light, but with a faint bluish glow that seeps under the door and the thin cloth you call a curtain. You awaken to the same song. Your breath fogs in front of your face. The fire has shrunk to embers, and every joint in your body feels like it slept in a pile of frozen stones. You wiggle your toes inside your wool wrappings. Miraculously, they're still attached. Outside, it's windless but bitter. The kind of still, silent cold that feels like nature holding its breath, or maybe plotting something. You shove a bit of snow aside and find the water bucket frozen solid again. Of course, it's now day, 47, 48? Of the long cold, you've lost track. You no longer even pretend that spring is close. It's laundry day. Or at least it would be if laundry didn't turn into medieval popsicles the moment you step outside. You consider washing a pair of socks and hanging them by the fire. But you're not emotionally ready to deal with the smell of wet wool for the next 6 hours. You tuck them back under the bed like a coward and go to stir the stew pot instead. There's a scrap of salted pork left, a victory. You add it to the pot with dried peas and a handful of something that might be turnip, might be sadness. It stews slowly, the smell filling the room like a long-lost friend. You take small sips, eyes half closed, savoring it like royalty. And honestly, for a brief moment, it kind of feels like a feast. Historically, stew was the medieval equivalent of fridge cleanout day, a perpetual pot where you threw in whatever you had. yesterday's cabbage, a crust of bread, maybe some dried mushrooms if you were fancy. And people actually passed this pot down through generations. One famous French family reportedly kept a stew going for more than 20 years. Historians still argue whether this was impressive or horrifying. You glance at your own pot. It's only been 2 weeks, and already it looks like it could start speaking Latin at any moment. You stir it again, just to be safe. After your pseudo-feast, it's time to fetch more wood. The path to the woodshed is a treacherous obstacle course of ice, half-buried tools, and what you're 40% sure was once a chicken. You push through it anyway, heart full of fire-fetching optimism. By the time you reach the shed, your cheeks are frozen, your eyelashes have developed icicles, and your hands no longer work. Inside the shed, the wood is, predictably, still wet. You knock a few logs together, like you're judging their density in some lumber-based spelling bee. One sounds sort of hollow. You take it. It drips on your shoe. You stack what you can carry, just enough to not throw out your back, and trudge home. Every step is heavier than the last. You're sore, tired, and slightly snowblind. You pass your neighbor Hans, who's arguing with a goose. Again, as you warm up by the fire, you listen to the village bell ringing again. But this time, it's different. 3 short chimes. Not disaster. A gathering. Probably in the longhouse. You throw on every wearable item of clothing you own, including a scarf that smells like sheep, and make your way over. The longhouse is one of the few buildings warm enough to stand in for more than 10 minutes. The council is meeting today, discussing grain rations, wood sharing, and whether Martha's fish skin roof needs a proper intervention. You sit near the fire and listen. The debate is mostly calm until someone brings up the idea of rationing beer. That gets loud, very loud. In a rare moment of peace, one of the elders shares a tale. A folk tale about a winter so cold that wolves froze mid-howl, and a shepherd who survived by curling up with his sheep under a fallen barn. Quirky as it sounds, there are genuine, historical accounts of people relying on livestock for warmth, even letting goats into their huts when temperatures drop dangerously low. Historians still argue whether this was widespread or just regional desperation. You smile, imagining yourself wrapped in a sheep like a medieval burrito. It's a warm thought, which is more than you can say for most of today. On your way home, it starts snowing again. Of course it does, but this time, it's the light kind. Soft, drifting flakes that don't sting your face or blind you. They melt on your cheeks and sparkle like dust in the lamplight. You pause in the street, the village around you silent and half covered in glittering white. It's not pleasant exactly, but it's peaceful. You can see why the poets liked this part. Back in your hut, you hang your outer layers on hooks by the fire. The steam rising from them fills the room with that now familiar scent of wool and wet socks. You refill your stew pot, what's left of it, and nestle into your furs. Alfred the rat is asleep in the rafters. You're pretty sure he's made a nest out of the sleeve you lost last month. Good for him. As the wind picks up again outside, you think about how much you've endured this winter. The hunger, the cold, the endless damp socks. And yet, you're still here, still breathing, still warming your hands on a fire you chopped the wood for, still smiling, even if it's mostly because the beer wasn't rationed after all. Tonight, the wind howls in a new octave, one that rattles your shutters like bones and whistles through the cracks in your door like a haunted flute solo. The cold has leveled up, again. You huddle under your layers, now more of a fabric-based fortress than a blanket, and stare at the flickering shadow the candle casts on the ceiling. You start giving it names. That tall flicker on the left? Definitely Sir Wiggleflame. You're not proud of this moment, but it's keeping you sane. Outside, the world is buried again. The snow's so high against the walls that opening the front door now involves minor excavation. You briefly consider tunneling, but remember, last time you tried and fell into the pig trough. By mid-morning, though let's be honest, time has lost all meaning. You're on your third reboil of the same barley soup. You add a few dried herbs, possibly mint, possibly mold. You're not sure anymore. Either way, it improves the flavor. You venture outside again because the hut has started to feel smaller than your own skin. Your boots crunch through layers of ice and slush, and the sky is a blank gray slab overhead. You pass the village well, which now has a sad-looking bucket frozen halfway up the rope like it just gave up trying. You head toward the monastery, not for divine guidance, really, but because they're rumored to have books, warm rooms, maybe even dried apples. It's practically a resort by medieval standards. Inside, it's stone cold, but dry. And the monks offer you weak ale and a seat by the fire. They're copying manuscripts, squinting at ink in flickering candlelight. One of them explains that some of the books were brought here from France, others from the Byzantine Empire. It feels like another world, and in a way, it is. You run your fingers along a page filled with illuminated letters, marveling at the gold ink. A depiction of the Last Judgment stares back at you. Everyone in it looks cold too. One monk tells you stories about saints who survived winters in caves, sustained only by prayer and snowmelt. You smile politely, but silently wonder if any of them had Alfred the Rat to keep them company. Fun fact, monasteries often served as literal refuges during brutal winters. They had better insulation, food supplies, and even early forms of central heating like hypocausts in rare cases. Historians still argue whether peasants were ever formally invited in or just sort of showed up and hoped for the best. You sit there until your fingers thaw enough to feel like fingers again, and your soul, briefly, feels full. As you prepare to leave, one monk slips a sliver of wax into your hand. "For the draft in your roof," he says. You don't ask how he knows. The wind is somehow worse on the way back. You wrap your scarf tighter, one eye on the horizon. The trees are skeletons, the paths are invisible, and the snow crunches underfoot like salt on burned toast. You find your way home mostly by instinct, partly by tripping into your neighbor's goose again. It honks disapproval. You accept this. Once home, you patch the wax over the roof crack, right above your bed. It drips slowly with heat and plugs the hole perfectly. You stare at it for a long time, like a miracle in miniature. Later, you gather with the villagers again, this time for music. A few people bring crude instruments, a fiddle, a wooden flute, something that might once have been a drum and now resembles a very angry cheese wheel. Someone sings. It's not quite in tune, but it's beautiful anyway. The melody loops like a lullaby, circling and circling until even your goose-chilled toes feel warm. Here's the thing. Music wasn't just entertainment in medieval winters. It was survival. People sang to pass time, to remember stories, to drown out the wind. Historians still argue whether certain folk tunes preserved entire histories that never made it into writing. Back at your hut, the candles burned low again. You've stopped keeping track of how many you've gone through. You think back to that monastery page with the tiny gilded fire curling in a corner. There's something about the idea of people preserving warmth, not just with wool and firewood, but with stories, songs, pages, laughter. You watch the wax patch on your ceiling. It holds. The wind rattles, but your little home doesn't give in. Not tonight. And for all its hardships, frozen wells, goat drama, nearly sentient laundry, this winter, in its endless white silence, has carved something into you. A patience, a stillness, even a strange kind of gratitude. You've learned how to live slow, to savor hot soup like wine, to find peace in a candle flame. You curl under your blanket fortress again, listening to the wind like it's trying to tell you a bedtime story. You decide not to answer back. Let it rant. You've got your stew, your wax patch, your rat roommate, and the memory of a flute tune still echoing in your ears. Tomorrow, the cold will come again. But tonight, you're warm enough. The wind doesn't exactly stop. It just quiets for a bit, like it's gone off to sulk. Maybe it ran out of fresh insults to hurl at your window. Either way, the world outside your hut settles into a sleepy hush, and you open your eyes to a pale, crystalline morning. You stretch beneath your blanket stack, 5 layers, give or take a small tapestry, and cautiously extend a foot. The floor greets it with the same tender caress as a glacier. Your breath fogs instantly. Congratulations, you're still alive. The soup pot is solid again. You chip off a chunk and gnaw it like a medieval popsicle. It's edible adjacent. You miss summer fruit with an ache that feels ancestral. The door creaks open to reveal the village green blanketed in new snow. A child is poking at it with a stick, likely trying to determine if it's the kind that eats shoes. 2 pigs wander aimlessly in the distance. One of them is wearing a hat. You choose not to investigate. Today, you've been summoned, yes, summoned, to help reinforce the communal barn. Apparently, the last snowstorm cracked a beam, and if the roof collapses, the cows will take it personally. So, wrapped in every item of clothing you own, including one suspiciously itchy sock as a hat, you trudge through knee-deep slush to the barn. Barn work in winter is not glamorous. It involves lifting things that feel like logs, but smell like goats. It also involves being stared down by said goats, who clearly think they could have done a better job with the beam if only they had thumbs. A local blacksmith arrives to help. His hands are red from cold, but he carries a glowing metal pin to fasten the new beam. He jokes it's the only warm thing in the county. You believe him. Midway through the work, someone brings hot cider. It's barely warm, mostly watery, and the mug has a mysterious chip, but it tastes like luxury. You sip it with closed eyes and dream briefly of apple trees. Interestingly, communal repair wasn't just neighborly, it was survival. Most villages operated like a shared household. If one barn collapsed, everyone lost something: milk, meat, warmth, possibly their one source of cow-based emotional support. Historians still argue whether this form of shared labor was voluntary or subtly coerced by sheer peer pressure. The work takes hours. At one point, someone slips and nearly knocks over a pile of hay bales. This sparks a 10-minute laugh break. In the dead of winter, even mildly amusing things feel hilarious. Your standards have adjusted. That goat chewing on your mitten? Comedy gold. As the sun begins to dip, though dip implies it ever got high, the villagers finish the job. The new beam is in place, snug and solid. One old man pats it like a dog. You suspect he's named it, probably Beamy. Back at your hut, your body hums with exhaustion. You smell like sawdust and goat breath. And honestly, it's not the worst thing you've smelled this week. You peel off your outer layers one by one, like a particularly indecisive onion. Dinner is a miracle. One of your neighbors traded some dried fish for winter onions, and you've got actual stew. With texture, with flavor. You weep. Not dramatically. Your tears would freeze, but it's emotional all the same. Alfred the rat returns with a vengeance. He's brought a friend. You pretend not to notice. Roommates are hard to come by in this real estate market. You fall asleep briefly, but are woken by a sound. Singing. Low and steady, carried on the wind. You wrap yourself up again and step outside. The villagers are gathered by the communal hearth in the center of town. They've built a snow fort around it to block the wind. It's weirdly effective. Someone's strumming a lute, and people are singing, a hymn maybe, or a folk song. You don't know the words, but the melody soaks into you. You hum along. Someone hands you a scrap of bread, warm from being stuffed in a coat. You eat it in 2 bites and feel full in a way stew doesn't quite manage. This, you realize, is how people made it through. Not just fire and food, but this. Cold noses pressed together, off-key harmonies, goats snorting in the background, bread passed hand to hand. Fun fringe tidbit. Some winter festivals even involved light-hearted role reversals, like letting the youngest child rule the household for a day. Historians still argue whether this was symbolic rebellion or just an excuse to make Dad wear a hat with bells. You stay out longer than you should, long after your toes have gone numb again. But the laughter and warmth linger, like an invisible cloak. You even catch yourself smiling. Eventually, you return to your hut. The candle burns low again. The wax patch on the ceiling is holding strong. You tuck yourself in and think of the beam in the barn. The song by the fire. The blacksmith's hot pin. The goats with opinions. Outside, snow continues to fall in delicate spirals. Each flake a tiny, stubborn marvel. The cold is still there, still sharp and unrelenting. But somehow, it feels a little less personal now. Like winter has stopped picking on you specifically and just decided to be generally rude. Tomorrow might bring more snow, more chores, possibly another mitten theft. But tonight, you're full of stew and song and cider, and that's enough. Morning greets you, not with warmth or bird song, but with the delicate sound of icicles dripping. It's warmer, just barely, which is to say, your water pail is now slush, and your breath fogs only when you sigh deeply in disbelief. But to your winter-addled brain, this feels like a tropical vacation. You stumble outside in your boots, still damp from yesterday, and your toes whisper legal threats. The world looks brighter, as if the sun remembered it's supposed to exist. Children are out already, trying to sled down what amounts to a very gentle hill with a wooden board and a lot of optimism. One crashes into a hay bale. Everyone cheers. Today, you have a mission. You've volunteered to help gather wood with the forager. You didn't do this out of kindness, of course, but because they promised to stop by the abandoned mill on the way. The one with the mice, the spooky noises, and, rumor has it, a stash of moldy apples that might still be edible if you squint. The forager, a wiry woman named Elfrida, greets you with a nod and a bundle of sticks on her back that's bigger than she is. She moves fast, her cloak fluttering behind her like a flag of defiance against frostbite. You follow her into the woods. They're quieter than you expect. Snow muffles everything. Your footsteps crunch. Birds flutter out of reach, and branches creak faintly above. The cold is more dignified here. Less angry wind, more gently haunting you with ghost squirrels vibes. As you walk, Elfride points out plants that survive the winter. Dried rose hips, useful for tea. Pine resin, good for sealing leaks. Mistletoe, which the local priest insists is either sacred or completely demonic, depending on his mood. Historians still argue whether mistletoe had true ritual importance, or if it was just a leafy excuse to kiss people awkwardly at solstice gatherings. At one point, you stop to admire a tree that looks like it's mid-curtsy. Elfride tells you it was struck by lightning last summer and now grows sideways out of sheer stubbornness. You relate deeply. You reach the old mill around midday. It's mostly collapsed. The wheel is cracked, the roof missing, and moss grows with wild abandon over the stone foundation. It's beautiful in a way that's both serene and mildly ominous. Inside, there are apples, or what once were apples. Most have collapsed into organic suggestions, but Elfrida, miracle worker that she is, finds a few that are only slightly mummified. You gnaw one with caution. It's tart, vaguely bitter, and tastes like victory. Fringe. Tidbit. Some rural medieval folk believed that certain buildings, especially mills and barns, had spirits, not necessarily malicious ones, just territorial. So, you tip your hat respectfully to the empty mill before you leave, just in case. The journey back is slower. Your arms are full of sticks. Your nose is running, and your legs feel like boiled noodles left out in the snow. You try to keep up, but Elfride is a woodland blur. At one point, she hops a frozen creek with the grace of a deer. You do not. You mostly just flail and land with a dramatic whoomp in a snowbank. She offers no help, but she does smile. You take it as encouragement. When you finally get back to the village, your cheeks hurt from the cold, and possibly from smiling. You haven't fallen into a stream, or been attacked by a goose all day. That counts as a win. You unload your sticks into the communal woodpile and are rewarded with a bowl of stew and a spot near the fire. The fire is alive today, crackling, fierce, and defiant. You hold your hands near it and watch the steam rise off your sleeves. It smells of pine and smoke, and the faintest whiff of whatever someone spilled on it earlier this morning. Tonight is storytelling night. A few elders gather near the flames, sipping thin ale and speaking slowly, letting the words weave between the firelight and the drifting ash. One tells the story of a woman who tricked death by hiding under a pig. Another swears that once, in the year of the cracked bell, it snowed upside down. Everyone nods like this is perfectly logical. You're invited to share something, and you panic briefly. But then you remember the sideways tree and the lightning strike, and you recount your encounter with great drama and several invented flourishes. By the time you're done, the tree has gained a haunted spirit, a hidden treasure, and possibly a romantic subplot. They applaud anyway. The blacksmith leans over and mutters, "Next time, tell them about the ghost sheep. That always kills." You make a mental note. You return to your hut later, cheeks sore from laughter and hands full of pine cones you don't remember collecting. Alfred the rat greets you like you've been gone for days. He's made progress tunneling into the grain sack. You let it slide. As you settle into bed, you realize you're starting to feel something strange. Something that might even be described as contentment. Not joy, not comfort, but the quiet satisfaction of surviving the cold with your soul mostly intact. The fire dies low. The wind returns, but you're no longer afraid of it. You've walked in it, eaten in it, fallen on your face in it, and you've come out the other side. Tomorrow, maybe you'll tell them the ghost sheep story. Add some bells, give the sheep a name. The wind howls again tonight, not as a scream, like the angry tempests of weeks past, but more of a prolonged sigh, like the world itself is exhausted from being cold for so long. You pull your blanket higher, waiting for sleep to find you. But your mind drifts to the villagers who don't have walls as sturdy or hearths as forgiving. You wonder how they make it through. In truth, many don't. Winter in the medieval world is an unrelenting editor. It pares down the population with casual cruelty, trimming away the weak, the unlucky, and sometimes just the poorly timed. Historians still argue whether more peasants died of malnutrition or disease during these months. But everyone agrees neither option is particularly glamorous. You rise early, wincing at the cold floor beneath your feet. Your breath curls like smoke in the air. Alfred the rat is missing, possibly hibernating in someone's boot. Smart lad, today's task is laundry. Yes, it still has to be done, even if the water could technically qualify as a frozen grave. You trudge to the stream with a few others, your bundle of dirt-encrusted linens tucked beneath your arm. It smells like smoke, sweat, and despair. The stream isn't completely frozen, but it's trying. You chip away at the crust of ice while your fingers threaten a strike. Washing clothes in winter is less cleaning and more briefly soaking in regret. By the end, your fingernails are blue, your arms ache, and the laundry looks slightly less horrifying than before. That counts. On your way back, someone drops a sock. It freezes to the ground in 12 seconds. You all pause, share a moment of silence, and keep walking. That sock now belongs to the stream gods. Later, you try to thaw out by scrubbing pots at the communal cookhouse. The big stew cauldron is never truly clean. Layers of mystery ingredients form a ring that archaeologists would later misinterpret as ritualistic. Still, the heat is good. You linger near the fire, pretending to scrub, while secretly enjoying the feeling returning to your fingertips. Someone suggests making candles, a rare treat, but useful. Tallow from the last pig slaughter is brought out, along with string and little clay holders. It smells challenging. Imagine old bacon mixed with wet wool and a whisper of despair. Still, the resulting candles flicker warmly once dried. You're oddly proud of them. Quirky tidbit of the day. Some medieval households believed that if a candle flickered too much, it meant a ghost was present. You casually nudge yours away from the draft just in case. In the afternoon, a monk passes through town. He's traveling on foot, wrapped in robes and sarcasm. You overhear him muttering about pagan mud and theological frostbite. He carries a pack of religious scrolls, some hard biscuits, and a flask of something that might be holy or fermented or both. You offer him a candle. He accepts, then blesses it dramatically. It flares a bit too brightly,